Great. Okay. Now, what do we
Okay,
do?
Chris. So I sent you over some questions.
Yeah.
So one of the things it's about reflective. You got a birthday coming up, 90 years old, and one of the things is reflecting on your life a little bit. And sometimes I wonder when you lived a life in the mountains and beyond the mountains, just what are the moments in your life that not the big things, but the things that come to your mind when you look back. Just these sort of I find these sort of moments interesting. What are your defining, not the defining ones, but ones that come to the front of your mind?
I think the most actually, yes, I was thinking about this before, and I think the period of my life when most was happening, when I was basically doing some of my best climbs, leading expeditions, and so on, and it was during the 60s. And I mean, it all started, I suppose, in 1960 when I actually made the first ascent of a mountain called Annapurna 2. And, as a young man going to the Himalayas for the first time, to make the first ascent of quite a rather a nice looking mountain that had never have been climbed, that is something that's very special. And then through the 1960s was the period when I did some of my best climbs, starting on very hard rock climbs in Britain, going when I basically went into the army, was stationed in Germany, and started climbing in the Alps and things like the first ascent, for instance, was the Central Pillar of Fresnay, which is probably one of the greatest things I've ever done, which is this incredible pillar on the south side of Mont Blanc. So it's all these things through the 60s that are so memorable.
Wow, wow, and the sort of is that the people, the things, the
And the people, and yeah, and if you, I think it will say it's special individuals on different things. I mean, for instance, on the Central Pillar of Fresnay, and I actually should quickly check here on the Central Tower of Piney, for instance, which is one of this magnificent peak in the very, very far south tip of South America. And there, for instance, I actually made the ascent with a guy called Don Willans, who was one of the most brilliant climbers that Britain's ever produced. Quite awkward to deal with, no, incredibly awkward to deal with. But once you got him in a mountain, you couldn't have a better person. And if you're in a really tight place, he was even better. And then also going on earlier climbs, like in fact for people like Tom Patey, with whom I also did various climbs with. So it is, just a whole load of people that are important to climbing and who've made important parts of my life. Or Mike Thompson, for instance, with whom we were at Sandhurst together. And you're in the same platoon, and so went through the Sandhurst experience. And then Mike did a whole series of some of my best climbs. He also comes from Cumbria, so we knew him from that point of view. And so all of these things, gave you these memories.
and things beyond your climbing mountaineering world. What are the things that you reflect on?
Well, not much beyond Mike. I would say my world has always been climbing and the mountains. And outside that, I haven't really been that interested. And I mean, even things I went, yeah, when I went to Sandhurst, when I was in the Royal Tank Regiment, all these things were part of what you were doing, but they weren't central to your life. And so it's really that and all these people and the memories of the people I have are strongly, and because of the actual experience that you'd actually gone through, whether it was, for instance, when we finally got to the top of the El Manahoy, which is this extraordinary pinnacle of rock on a sea stack, just on the other, just to the north of the far north tip of Scotland. And you can actually see it as you go through the sea between it. And it's a magnificent kind of thing. And when a friend of mine actually introduced to me a guy called Tom Patey, who's very important to me in my life, and who's the local doctor in the north of Scotland. And we went did a lot of climbing together. And it was really him talking about the Old Man of Hoy, and then said, well, let's go and climb it. And so we made the first descent of this one wonderful sea stack, which has become, iconic. It's a thing that people dream of doing. And then 2 years later, because it was so attractive, and a guy called Chris Bonington, who was tied in with the BBC at the time, and he persuaded the BBC to do as the biggest and most expensive outdoor broadcast that the BBC, I think, has ever done, either before or after. A colossal organisation, and I took part in that. So there's all these things, that are connected.
Brilliant. So, Chris, you talked about when you're younger, your younger days. Comparing there to now, how has your motivations for being outdoors and being adventure changed, and how has it stayed the same? The motivations.
I love being in the outdoors. My attitude to adventure, though, inevitably has changed. Let's face it, when I started climbing, I was a very, very good climber. I was probably one of the best in the country. And therefore, I was stretching myself to the limit. My physical powers were very, very considerable. And so I could do a heck of a lot. Inevitably, as you get older, those decrease. And so now, as I'm getting very close to 90, I should say now I get walking. I get out walking 5 or 6 kilometers a day, sometimes more than that, but just walking and thoroughly enjoying it. So that once the amount you can do declines, but your attitude to life doesn't change.
And that attitude stayed the same? Adventure and... Not adventure, but that attitude has stayed the same for you to be outdoors?
Oh, totally, yes. I love the outdoors. I love the outdoors. I love the beauty of nature. And I love, the difference, say, of having the view that I can see behind you of a kind of street there, which actually reminds me of when I was living, my family came from Wallasey, and I'd often go to stay with my maiden aunt, who lived in a little street rather like that as well. But nothing wrong with living in a little street like that, but it is very different from living in the wilds. I've been lucky enough to spend most of my life in the wilds, and that's really what drives you.
Chris, the BMC question, I know you're a BMC patron. What did you hope to bring to that role?
I think, well, I suppose to a degree they appreciate my name. Now, I'm deputy patron, and the patron of the BMC was essentially, it was always been a member of the royal family. When I came, basically, I came very much involved with Outward Bound, which is tied up with the BMC, and then on all our committees, there was always Impact and Palace, and immediately after I became a deputy patron, or it was then the Duke of Edinburgh was chairing it. And I must say, the Duke of Edinburgh was the finest kind of manager of a committee that I've ever come across. He actually let people have their say, but the moment they went off the point, he'd move them on very firmly and go on to the next person and so on. And so that, and there you're very lucky to have had people like that, that not only you've admired, I've met the Queen on several occasions, and so one's been very privileged to have met people like that. But you're also, when you come to think of it, you realize that all people are important and each individual is important. It doesn't matter what their background is. You need to take notice of them.
Sure, yeah. Okay, Chris, you've been writing books, been on TV all your life, and a lot of it has been, the thrust has been encouraging and inspiring people to experience what you've done, the outdoors. In the last few years, the number of participants enjoying the outdoors and the diversity, the numbers have just rocketed. How do you feel now that, do you feel that's been your wishes have come true, and what are the challenges and opportunities that this presents? Living in Cumbria, you must have noticed it quite a lot.
Well, I think, the fact that, hopefully that I've had an influence that has influenced people to actually want to get out into the hills. And I suppose kind of when you're catching the tube or you're waiting in a bus queue or something like that, and someone recognizes you and says, oh gosh, I was Chancellor of Lancaster University, and they say, well, you gave me my degree all those years ago, or I came to one of your lectures and that changed my life. And that kind of thing. I think, it's a little no doubt about it, a kind of pat on the back, kind of nice for your ego. But I think much more important, it actually shows that the things that you've been doing actually have had an influence for the good on other people.
Do you think that brings challenges, the increased numbers, or is it really just growing? Is it? Well, I think the countryside will absorb them.
Everything does change. I mean, if you focus, say, go and look towards Everest, and there you can have lots of mixed ideas. I mean, for instance, the first time I went to Everest was in 1970, or went to the Himalayas in 1970. But then the Himalayas were absolutely wonderful because there were in Nepal, for instance, there were no tourists. And Nepal had been a completely closed place. And we got in just as it began to open up. And so that it was very, very different from what it is now. And then, of course, Everest itself, was a huge challenge. And once again, on all my expeditions to Everest, even the big, if you like, siege-style expeditions I led, and we did, made the first ascent to the southwest face of Everest, the first ascent to the south face of Annapurna, and so on. They were, at that time, the great masses. It hadn't been commercialized. And it's just in the last 25, 30 years, that commercialization has got greater and greater and greater. Part of one regrets that, but then you've got to pull back and think, well, no, what's really important? And what is really important is not the kind of historic, romantic vision of Everest. It is actually the well-being of the people who are the ordinary people who live around Everest, and how the people of Nepal and the stretch of the Himalayas, how they're benefiting, how has that affected the lives they've led? And once again, there's pros and cons. But on the whole, I think the pros, the very fact that they have got a higher standard of living, the very fact that whereas 20, 40 years ago, there were some appalling famines when, a high percentage of the population died of starvation. That isn't happening any longer. And that these are the things that are really important. And so I think you've got to look at all these changes that have happened, but you've got to realize that I think, yeah, those changes were going to happen anyway. They've got the pros and cons, as I've said. And what is really important is how we live with the world we live in at the moment, and what the problems are of people at this moment, how they're going to cope in various areas we're interested in. And that is what I think is incredibly important. It'll never change. And that's where my focus is.
So, and almost reflecting on that, and with, I think there is increased pressure on the countryside. What role should the BMC play in managing this, or being a participant in this? You know, not a problem, but sort of the changes that are taking place. What would you advise them?
Well, I think the BMC have done a good job, and essentially it is, and I think they are. It is aware of all these changes, and they are. And I think what is really important is what is happening to the environment, and not the pretty side of the environment. That's important, yes, but the really important thing is, once again, how the people living in that environment are actually living and how they're benefiting. And then the focus should be on whether change needs to be made to give them a better quality of life, basically. And I think that is where I'd like to see, people focusing.
Okay, so this is something we've alluded to before, that you talked about the towers at Piney, which must have been such a remote place back then, Everest. So the world has changed so much in those 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. If someone's getting into adventure in the outdoors today, what advice would you give them, bearing in mind that it's such a different landscape? So adventure must be harder to find in some ways. What would you recommend? What would your advice to someone starting off today be?
I'd say go into the hills, go into wild country if you possibly can. And in actual fact, you don't have to go to Nepal or the North Pole to find real adventure and find interesting things to do. And if, for instance, you live in central London, I actually started my climbing when I went, there's a little sandstone outcrop to the south of London, about 30 feet high, called Harrison Rocks. But I there discovered the joy of climbing. And so, and just this is to demonstrate the fact that anyone will, I think anywhere in Britain, anywhere in Europe, will find that there are places quite close to them, even if they live in a city, where they can go and actually enjoy the outdoors and appreciate. I think the incredible thing is, appreciate natural beauty, but then having appreciated it, realize that, I've got to do as much as I can to help protect that natural beauty. And whether it's taking part in various clubs or organizations that actually do it, and there's loads of clubs and organizations that are interested in doing these kind of things. But it is actually not just be someone who says, I wish it was better, but actually get and try to do something in your own small way that actually helps protect the outdoors and natural beauty that we love.
Huh. So, Chris, towards my final question, these are the last couple of questions. One is, I was going to ask you about how you've, almost going to answer this for you. I was going to ask you how you've kept your love for the outdoors alive, but just listening to you talk, despite an amazing life full of trophies and the mantelpiece, you don't seem to exist in that past. You seem to, your mind seems on the present and the future. And am I right in thinking that? And is that something that's kept your passions alive?
Yes, and I think yes. I think it's very important to live in the present, and I think the really important thing, like what I certainly do, is that I live in the present. In the state I am at the moment, I'm physically incapable. My balance is absolutely bloody awful, I need if I'm going walking, I need a stick. But I still make the absolute most of the outdoors, of which I love. And I think this is a really important thing, that is to actually, yes, you've got to accept the state you're in. I think you've always, if you just accept it, if you like wallow, you're going to decline very quickly. So you've got to push yourself a bit. So you've got to push slightly outside that comfort barrier. So that, I mean, when you feel, oh God, I don't feel like going for a walk today. But no, let's get out, let's go for a walk. And the moment you actually do that, and where you feel bloody miserable, and then you get out and you start walking, it's amazing. All these problems that seem to be absolutely insuperable seem to vanish. And you're just beginning to realize, yes, it's a lovely view there. It's what a fantastic place we live in, and so on. And that is the important thing. So live in the present, appreciate the present. I think cherish the past, because the past is full of the memories, and the past is, let's face it, what happened in the past is where you are now. But you don't want to live in that past, but you need just to appreciate the past and what's happened in the past. You need to look into the future and what I'm going to do in the future. And I think that is, if you look, you're looking forwards, not backwards. And if you do that, I think you're going to have a more fulfilling current life, basically.
Chris, so much thank you for your time. Inspirational. It's as always beautiful to talk to you. Happy birthday.
Thank you.